What's amazing is that every time we have this topic, the whole room gets completely packed out. So if we have as the topic, did matriarchy ever exist? It is absolutely full. If we have another topic and lots of other topics, we have a lot of people here. It's very well attended, this, but it's not quite as full as these events. So it's wonderful that you're all here. And it is I don't know, it's just, it's great to see so many of you. And there's even some men here, which is great. No, there's quite a lot of men, not quite as many men as women, but it's great to see you all. So that was my sort of preamble. Do I need to say anything more about RAG? Anyone got any ideas, something I should say? We've still got people coming in. Okay, let's go, let's start. So, here at UCL and in the Radical Anthropology group, we're anthropologists, and that means that we really only ask one question, although it's rather a big one. What does it mean to be human? And as anthropologists, we explore that question in different ways. Probably the most familiar way is to ask how many different ways there are of being human, how many different ways there are right across the world of respecting the sacred, of caring for children, of arranging sexual relationships, of arranging an economy, of all those things. There's so many different ways. And as we're anthropologists, we think it's rather important that we don't make assumptions, and particularly the assumption that the way we do things in this part of the world, in the West, in London, is kind of the natural and obvious way of organising things. So that's one way. So just really, really briefly, we might think that, say, it's natural for a kid to have a mummy and a daddy. Well, sort of. But it's right across the world. It's actually most cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, horticultural cultures, the cultures that anthropologists have traditionally studied, they have a language which doesn't even have a term for mummy, which doesn't mean a whole lot of other mummies, or daddy, which doesn't mean a whole lot of other daddies. And so you have what's called a classificated kinship system, which actually stops you from discriminating between mine and thine. So if you're a woman and you've got a sister, it's quite hard for you to talk about my son without meaning your sister's son, because childcare tends to be collective. It isn't as individualistic as we assume is kind of natural. So anyway, that's one way of doing anthropology, looking at all the different ways there are of being human. Another way, which we do here at UCL particularly, is to study other creatures. So what might it mean to be a creature that's very intelligent, perhaps related to humans, but not exactly a human? So for example, what might it mean to be a gorilla or a chimpanzee? You can put things the other way around. A gorilla might be wondering what it means, it's not just that they're not quite human, we're not quite gorilla, and primatologists tend to look at things from the standpoint of the animals the primates that they study. We have here particularly, we have Volker Sommer, who actually thinks that primates, non-human primates, gorillas, chimpanzees, ought to be given human rights. And he make a very passionate argument on those grounds. So that's another way of examining what it might mean to be human, to think what's the dividing line? At what point do we say we are human? At what point do we say you're not? You might be intelligent, empathetic, all sorts of emotions and cleverness. I mean, chimpanzees are incredibly clever at politics and Machiavellian intelligence, and they have medicine chess and all sorts of things, but maybe to say human, we might think that we need a sort of boundary somewhere, but it's actually quite difficult to know where to draw that boundary. So that's another way of getting an angle on what it means to be human, in the sense that most of us in this room, I think most of us here are human. I can't see any gorillas here. And then there's another way of approaching the question, which is to ask about the past, the evolutionary past. What might it have meant to be Homo erectus, or going back even further, an Australopithecine. Australopithecines are creatures about 3 foot tall, with a brain slightly bigger than a chimpanzee's, but they were walking on 2 legs and they were making tools, and they're our distant ancestors. Or we can ask, what might it mean to be a Neanderthal? Neanderthals were living in Europe before us lot. We call ourselves Homo sapiens. We arrived from Africa in this part of the world, in Europe, about 40,000 years ago. But the Neanderthals actually did a lot of things before we did. The earliest art in Europe actually was certainly produced by Neanderthals. And they were not stupid. They actually had bigger brains than we have. So it's a really interesting question to ask, what might it mean to be a Neanderthal? We've got a few people here not having seats. Is that because there aren't any seats, or is it because we're not organising things properly? Are there any seats? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
We can get the chairs out.
So, among other things, when we ask what it means to be human, we're actually interested in a topic where even if you use the word human nature, some people get a bit worried about that. Is there such a thing as human nature? And I think there is. For example, all humans are born with the cognitive equipment to acquire the grammar of a language. A language, the grammar of a language, any language, is probably the most complex theoretical structure we have any knowledge of. And yet a child masters that structure really early without any effort. A chimpanzee can't. Of course, you could say, why would it want to? Can we master chimpanzee language? They do have a kind of language, of course. But there's not really much doubt that humans are, we have a nature. We have certainly in anthropology, in this department here at University College London, we're very interested in evolutionary questions and in biology. And if we're looking at biology, I know I'm coming to the question of matriarchy in a moment. The most clear thing, the most obvious thing is that we humans come in two kinds, only one of which can get pregnant. And I mention that because in a way you wouldn't think so from all the books which have been written on human origins, because most of the books in the past, at any rate, have been about man the toolmaker, or man the hunter, or man the thinker, or man this, or man that, or man the other. And of course you can be politically correct about that and justify it, because you can say, well, actually a woman's as good as a man, so why mention women? And that's sort of what has happened in origins narratives. And you might again wonder why I'm even talking about origins narratives, is because the question I'm addressing here about matriarchy, did it ever exist? Clearly there are some societies, there were some societies, perhaps there still are some societies where women have a dominant role. But the big question is, were we once matriarchal? Were all humans, were we at some point in the past, in the prehistoric past or the evolutionary past, did women rule? Okay, that's the big question I'm asking. And so we're looking at the deep evolutionary as well as historical past. And that's quite an important question to ask, because very often it is assumed, certainly assumed in this culture, that there's something natural about male dominance. And it's easy to make an argument. It's easy to say, well, males are a bit stronger, they can push people around a bit more, they haven't got kids, so they can maybe fight a bit more freely without having to worry about damaging the children. And maybe it's natural for males to dominate over females. And then, of course, you get the argument, well, we've evolved from some kind of non-human primate ancestral species. And it is true that with non-human primates, chimpanzees, for example, males dominate over females. In the case of common chimpanzees, the dominance is quite extreme. Every male dominates pretty much every female in quite a despotic way. So it's easy to assume, isn't it, that male dominance is natural. It's part of human nature. It's as natural for men to dominate women as for us to have 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand. And if you think that, you'll probably also think that not even the most massive social, political, radical change could alter that fact. Maybe not even a revolution could change human nature, could change the balance of power between the sexes. Maybe not even Jeremy Corbyn could do that. Okay, that's a joke, by the way, political joke. Right. Okay, some more people coming in. I don't know if there's any way of people sitting down somewhere. So just on that subject, it's probably, oh yeah, okay, there are a few seats if people are moving up a bit. It's relevant to say that one species of chimpanzee, we used to call them pygmy chimps, and they're now known as bonobos. They're not genetically more closely related to us than common chimps, but in behavioral terms, they probably are more like humans. They seem to be more intelligent. They pick up language a bit quicker. They're less hairy. Various other things about bonobos, and these close primate relatives of ours are matriarchal. what happens is that females form coalitions. They bond together. So there might be some reason for some kind of conflict over resources. Two females might find some food, and they could compete with each other for that food. Does anyone know what in fact they do? They bond. They have sex. Exactly. So the two chimpanzee females will sort of sit down, lie on their backs, rub their genitals together, get quite a nice feeling, and then they're not related, by the way, to each other, but now they're kind of sisters in the sense that they're really closely bonded. And as a result of that, they can beat up any male. And so if they, for example, two females might catch a small antelope, and they do. They actually hunt small animals. And the male might want to steal that meat from them. No, the females will beat him up and keep the meat for themselves. So there's no question about it. If any sex is dominant, it's the female. And so why make the assumption that we must always have been male-dominated? There's no justification for that. No scientific justification for that. Okay, so now the question is, did matriarchy ever exist? And I'm going to give a short answer and then a rather long-winded answer for the rest of this talk. Now, the short answer is yes, but not as we know it. So yes, there was at one time when we were essentially matriarchal, but it wasn't as if women permanently ruled in anything like the way in which under patriarchy men permanently rule. And I'll just really briefly say this before going on to sort of bring the whole thing together through a bit of a journey. Morna Finnegan is one of RAG's anthropologists, published beautiful stuff in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. The Politics of Eros was a wonderful article she published not so many years ago. And she has a concept. And the concept is communism in motion. And her argument, based on her field work, but also based on the work of other anthropologists like Jerome Lewis here, who's done many years' work with the forest people of Central Africa, the Congo. What happens is that women seize the power in a ritual, so that all the women gather together and have a really powerful ritual, and they scare the men right out of the camp in a laughing, sexy, raucous challenge to men, making all kinds of jokes about men's behaviour, maybe their equipment and stuff, and the men sort of don't know where to put themselves, and the women rule. But after a few days of women's rule, the women feel, and this ritual is called Ngoku, the women feel, okay, we've made our point, a bit boring to keep on ruling for, permanently. And so the women have a decision that, okay, now we're going to let the men have their turn. And then there's quite a bit of sex, of course, and the men take over for a while, but the men aren't allowed to outstay their welcome. After the men have had their ritual, a bit of swaggering, a bit of muscle, a bit of, throwing their weight around, kind of, ultimately in a playful way, okay, there's a limit to that. And the women then take over. So you have the women's power, men's power, women's power, men's power. And we have a theory in RAG, it is a theory, maybe a bit controversial, but we have all kinds of reasons for thinking it, that the calendar used was the calendar which even to this day all the world's religions still use, and it's the moon. All the world's religions have festivals related, ultimately, if you think of Judaism, Islam, even Christianity with Easter, ultimately the moon. And we have reasons for thinking that this pendulum of movement between the two gender groups was linked to the changing phases of the moon. And our evidence for that is largely from African hunters and gatherers. So I've just said it quickly, and I'm going to come back to that topic of communism in motion and African hunters and gatherers in a few minutes. But where we want to start is at the beginning, and that means evolutionary theory. And again, when I say that, sometimes people they raise their eyebrows. They say, "What on earth is Chris Knight talking about evolutionary theory when he's just been mentioning hunters and gatherers? What's the point of studying things like Darwinism when you're supposed to be talking about humans?" And honestly, it really is quite an issue. It's regarded in some quarters within anthropology as a little bit controversial to be doing evolutionary biology at the same time as you're doing social and cultural anthropology. Well, we think it is important because we're interested in what it means to be human, where did we come from, how did it happen that we became this rather unusual, or very unusual, species, humans, with our language abilities and so many other things. And the book, which everyone really ought to read, this is compulsory reading, by the way, compulsory reading. I don't quite know how to force you to read it, but I'm going to do my best. Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, Mothers and Others, the evolutionary origins of mutual understanding. And what she's arguing is that, and this is almost this part of it's a kind of cliche, cooperation made us human. I mean, that you'll hear that so often. We're the cooperative species, man the hunter, we cooperated and killed lots of animals and all that stuff, which is kind of true. But no, Sarah Hurdy is saying no, the form of cooperation which set us off on our journey, which was the most fundamental form of cooperation, which was the root of everything else which happened, including language, was cooperation in childcare. Cooperation in childcare. And okay, now you might think surely other primates have cooperation in childcare. No, not actually. Every chimpanzee female, when she has kids, she's a single mum. She's a single mum, even though she lives in quite a large group, because she dare not give her baby to anyone else. Because chimpanzee society, I'm thinking of common chimps in particular, but actually even with bonobos, it's not all that different, even with that sort of matriarchal system. They don't actually share their offspring. You dare not give your vulnerable baby to somebody else, because politics is what we call Machiavellian. It's quite competitive. And there's not sufficient trust for a chimpanzee female to be able to give her baby for someone else to carry. In the case of common chimps, well actually bonobos as well, it's because she won't have relatives. So with chimpanzees, when the female comes of age and she starts getting interested in sex, she's got to move out from her group and form sexual relationships in a neighbouring group where she doesn't have relatives. So this female won't have sisters, won't have mum, and there's no one really she dares give her kid to look after. So she's a single mum. And if everyone here knows, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, you all know it already, there's not any job more demanding than looking after a kid. It's more than a full-time job. It's a double, treble full-time job, of course. But chimpanzees, when they are as being single mums, they're under pressure to sort of minimise the burdens of childcare, and the way they do that is to make sure, this is not conscious, of course, this is a question of Darwinian natural selection, that the babies aren't, babies can be more or less precocious. They can have larger brains or slightly smaller brains. And if the babies have got a slightly larger brain, it'll be slower to develop, it'll be more demanding of high quality food, and there comes a point where the female can't afford the costs of that baby. And so what happens is that the smaller brain babies do a little bit better. And the result of that is what's called a grey ceiling. So if you're a primate single mum, do you want to try and come in, everybody, outside? Just try and work your way through into the room. I'm sorry there's not much space. So on the basis of kind of isolated childcare, everybody being a single mum, there's a limit to how big the brain of your babies can get. And the point about humans is that we've smashed through that grey ceiling. We have an incredibly large brains. Now, at 3 times the size of a chimpanzee brain. And it's just like, it's gone through the roof, the size of our brain. And modern Darwinians, and I should perhaps mention this comes from what's often called selfish gene Darwinism, is a kind of economics where everything that has a benefit also has a cost. And the thing about brains is, although they're wonderful things to have, they're costly to produce and maintain. And so the question we have to ask is, how was it that in the course of human evolution, ancestral mothers were able to afford the costs of babies whose brains over evolutionary time were getting bigger and bigger, and therefore babies that were more and more demanding of childcare? And we know the answer. It was to reverse the pattern of non-human primates of moving out to find sex. In the human case, we don't know exactly when, but we can probably correlate it with the increase in brain size around, I don't know, I'll leave all that stuff out. But it was what seems to have happened is that the female in the human case began living with mum, living with mum, living with mum, so that the kid would have grandmother. And that's known as the grandmother hypothesis. It was developed by Christian Hawkes, an American anthropologist, in the 80s after studying the Hadza, hunter-gatherers in Africa. So living with mum means that you can afford because you're sharing that burden of childcare, you can afford to have a baby that's got a slightly larger brain. And over evolutionary time, the brain gets bigger and bigger and bigger because you can afford that large brain. So, and of course, if you're living with mum, and she's the one figure that you know you can rely on for childcare. And if you're living with mum, because your sisters will be living with mum, you're also living with your sisters. And so you have a coalition now able to offset the costs of childcare, because childcare is now becoming more and more collective. And then the last part of the story, I'm going really quickly through this. We're going to hear a lot more about how it all happened in much more concrete detail. The last part of the story is that the coalitions which evolving human females formed to look after each other's children, like sisterhoods along with their mums, discovered a new use for their solidarity, a new use for their coalitions, and that was to use the leverage of a gender coalition to do something really remarkable, which is to get the male, the leisured sex, at long last to help. Because with non-human primates, the male does nothing. I don't say the males are completely and utterly useless. They provide a bit of sperm, and that gets you pregnant. But beyond that, they don't do a lot. And it was the most difficult thing was to get the male to actually get roped into helping to provide for the babies, instead of just getting somebody pregnant and moving off and getting somebody else pregnant and then moving off and getting somebody else pregnant. And the way that was done was to make badly behaved males, I just mentioned what I meant by badly behaved males, getting somebody pregnant, moving off, getting somebody else. Of course, from a chimpanzee point of view, that's not bad behavior at all. That's what chimpanzees do. And the females don't need males to hang around. What use is a male once you're pregnant, you know? But from a human point of view, with this extra large brain burdensome babies, there came a point when actually the coalitions of females could make use of the male beyond just getting enough sperm to get pregnant. And so badly behaved males find they don't get a lot of sex. And I think Camilla's going to be talking about that. There's already an article actually on open democracy which she's done. We're going a little bit further. We're even saying the first word in human language was spoken by women. And what was that word? No. Right, the evidence for all this. Well, we're particularly interested in asking hunter-gatherers for insights into what it means to be human. African hunter-gatherers, in particular, are informative, because they're still living, in some cases, under conditions similar to those in which our species evolved, just in this one sense, which is that they're living in a continent which has large animals, giraffe, zebra, even elephants, of course. And African hunter-gatherers are egalitarian. Actually, perhaps I should just give you a couple of concepts. In anthropology, we distinguish two types of hunter-gatherers. Those that have storage, and therefore property, which can be accumulated and used to create inequalities, and those that don't. And those that don't, we call them immediate return hunters and gatherers, no storage. African hunter-gatherers, pretty much all of them, are immediate return. And they're not just egalitarian, they're assertively egalitarian, and they are gender egalitarian. And among African hunter-gatherers, and here to different degrees, we've all been particularly interested in studying these people and actually asking them questions about how they live their lives. They can give us much better information than farmers about the essence of being human, about how it was that we are human, how the things which part of human nature we take for granted, like for example laughter. Humans laugh. Okay, it's a strange sound when we laugh. It has a function actually. It's a leveling device. I can go into that a little bit. Anyone that gets a little bit above themselves in a hunter-gatherer society gets immediately leveled by humour and brought down to earth with a bump. So hunter-gatherers kind of understand that. It's the way they live. Farmers tend to be a bit more serious, not so much laughter. Obviously, we laugh when we're off work, we're relaxing and having a drink or something. But laughter isn't quite what makes the world go round for capitalism. It's whereas for hunter-gatherers, laughter is very much what makes the world go round. It's always they're very playful cultures. Okay, And one of the things to stress about African hunter-gatherers is their element of ritual and ceremony. So the core rituals and ceremonies are nothing to do with marriage. You don't even really have marriage. In fact, I should not say, I should say quite categorically, marriage is not an institution for hunters and gatherers. Of course, people have sex, okay. But the crucial thing which happens to you as you're coming of age is called initiation. And in Africa, the ceremony which is most important is a girl's initiation ceremony. Usually triggered, not always, but always associated with her first menstruation, but sometimes directly triggered by her first menstruation. So it's a first menstruation ceremony. And women control that most important of all the ceremonies. And again, if you're new to anthropology, please come in, everybody. There's a lot of people outside not able to get in. Yeah.
Can you ask people at the front to move back? We can have people sitting at the front.
Do you mean this?
You ask them to move this way.
Okay. It's been suggested to me that we move back a bit so that people can sit on the floor. Do you feel like sitting on the floor rather than standing up? There's a nice carpet here.
What if you pull a table back there? There's a couple of chairs as well.
Yeah, there's about 6 people that need to be able to sort of feel comfortable.
Is there space?
Great, thank you. Okay, there's a room to sit here on a nice, comfy, quite clean carpet. Promise you, it's quite clean. Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thanks. So, okay. So what I've just said is that the women control in Africa, in these immediate return hunter-gatherers societies, they control the most important rituals, and these are girls' initiation rituals, triggered by a girl's first menstruation. And you might say, if you're new to anthropology, okay, the women do the sort of parties. So what? Why is that important? Well, no, actually, in hunter-gatherer societies, the ceremonies, the rituals, they're where the power resides. So the ceremonies are almost, kind of analogy might be, they're the Houses of Parliament. They're where the crucial power resides, although I'm not sure it does reside in the House of Parliament in this country, but it sort of does. But the childcare coalitions are the core of the whole community. And the initiation rituals are absolutely central and controlled by women. And during those rituals is no doubt about who rules. It's the women will be, if you like, ruling for the period of the ceremony, which can be quite a number of days. Okay, now what we're saying here, what I'm saying now is, you might ask, okay, is this mainstream anthropology? I would say it's a bit of a difficult question to ask. Is it controversial? Is it mainstream? It's absolutely mainstream if you think it's important to stick to fundamental orthodox principles of Darwinism, which we do, and Sarah Hrdy absolutely does. And it's certainly mainstream if you think that it's quite important to ask, if you're interested in what it means to be human, to not just ignore hunter-gatherers, but to ask hunter-gatherers in particular. But it's true that the theory that I'm putting forward is controversial. And of course, one of the great things about science is that there aren't any gurus. That you can't be a guru. You can't have a sort of a philosophy and impose it on people. Immediately you say anything, everyone will try to pull down your theory and point out that all kinds of facts and evidence contradicts it. So there are really good reasons why any theory, when it's relatively new, is treated as controversial, and it takes a while for any theory to kind of settle down and become accepted. But when we're talking about these topics about gender and sex and maybe especially menstruation, there are other reasons, other factors which make a theory controversial. And what I mean is that the theory can actually upset people. It can upset priests and bishops and theologians. And I mean that. People do sometimes find it difficult to talk about gender in the ways as anthropologists we feel we kind of need to. So just remember that all Britain's universities, not all of them, but the dominant universities, they were once theological colleges. And there were some things you just couldn't talk about. And one of them was, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, but the Christians, I'm just going to sort of pick on Christians because I come from a Christian background myself, had a big problem, and maybe still have a big problem, with two things. One of them is women, and the other is the moon. And in mythology, of course, the two things are kind of linked. And of course, there are certain topics which are just so intimately and internally taboo that you can't even mouth them. And those, they both begin with M. Menstruation and the moon. They're quite closely linked etymologically. The Indo-European root me, M-E, meant measurement. Okay, so menstruation is moon change. The moon is the measurer. Commensurate, mental, even probably men are all to do with the idea that the humans measure, and of course what you're measuring is time, and the moon and the menstrual cycle are both kind of clocks measuring time. But somehow those topics are just intrinsically controversial, and so even I find I'm kind of got over it now. But when I mention either of those two topics as a man, people would give me kind of funny looks, and I don't think that's a very good reason why theory should be controversial, just because you're not supposed to mention those topics. Because, as I say, we come in two kinds. Half of us are female, and it seems rather important to acknowledge that in all our theories about origins and everything else. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the history of this topic. In the 19th century, in the late 19th century, from about 1860 onwards, after somebody called Bachhofen wrote a book called Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, arguing that the family, in the course of history, was originally matriarchal. Before long, Lewis Henry Morgan, for many people, the founder of modern kinship studies, and therefore the founder of modern anthropology, Lewis Henry Morgan, Beethoven, Morgan, Engels, Friedrich Engels, I don't know, Sir James Fraser, Emil Durkheim, Sigmund Freud, I mean, all the, mostly men of course, all the savants, all the armchair theorists, and anthropologists such as they were, had a consensus about things. And the consensus was that early human kinship was matrilineal, and early human society was matriarchal. Everyone agreed with that. It was a general view that the nuclear family wasn't the original cellular unit, basic unit of human social organization. It was the matrilineal clan within which childcare was collective. So you had group motherhood, a whole bunch of sisters, each looking after each other's children. And there are various examples, like the Iroquois Longhouse in New York, studied by Lewis Henry Morgan, where there would be a longhouse, that's literally a long house made of birch branches and birch bark, and along the middle would be a line of hearths looked after by women, all sisters. There would be a matriarch, and the oldest women probably in charge of everything, of the common stores, and they'd have husbands visiting, but they wouldn't really belong there. They'd have to, they might stay the night, but they didn't really have any rights there. They have to go back to mum for their rights. But the brothers would belong, the women's brothers would belong in the longhouse. That's just one example. And there are societies even today, many, I'll mention it in a moment perhaps, many societies that still organise along roughly similar lines of matrilineal descent and matrilocal residence. But what I'm saying is that the theory in the late 19th century, right up to the First World War, was pretty much agreed. There were some other theorists. There were sort of one or two people that argued for the tyrannical patriarch in charge of his harem as the original social system, but actually most anthropologists believe that early human kinship was matrilineal, and right across the world, all patriarchal societies, if you trace them back far enough, going back far enough, you'd find matriarchy, and that theory is called the theory of primitive matriarchy. Matriarchy everywhere preceded patriarchy. So what happened to that theory? Why did it change? And that's why I mentioned Christians, theologians, theology colleges, and kind of not very good reasons why theories get to become deemed to be controversial. Right, now, the greatest figure in British anthropology, the sort of founding father of anthropology in this country, was working down the road at the London School of Economics, and his name was Bronislaw Malinowski. And to try to put all this in kind of context, what you had was you had the First World War, and then that was followed by enormous political and social and sexual instability. So during the period of the height of the British Empire, those Victorian savants that I mentioned that argued that early human society was matriarchal, they also argued that early human society was matriarchal and also communistic. And maybe even more shocking, some of that communism was sexual communism. And they didn't really feel very threatened by that, because they said, well, yes, but these people are just savages. And over time, we've become civilized. And the peak of civilization, of course, is Victorian man. And what can supposing some savages somewhere in Africa now or in the past practiced matriarchal communism, that just shows how far we've advanced. And so they didn't mind, they felt kind of at ease about all that. But what happened was that the First World War changed everything. I'm sure all of you know this, more or less. Even before the First World War, you got very profound intimations of major change in Britain, for example, with the suffragettes movement, for example. And after the First World War, you got revolutionary movements. You had the Russian Revolution, you had the rise of social revolutionary political movements, including, of course, feminism. And Malinowski said he felt very uncomfortable about this. It's rather strange, because he spent the war in the Trobriand Islands to escape being interned as an alien. So he was in the Trobriand Islands, which was a matrilineal society, very, very sexually liberated. He wrote lots of things about sex life and matrilineal life in these rather idyllic islands, idyllic in the sense that the way he inspired people with the possibility of sexual liberation, writing about the Trobriand Islands. But when he came back to England, he became a kind of moral guardian, a custodian of the morals of society. And he wrote that even in our own home, we now feel threatened. And what he meant by that was that a man could feel threatened by his wife and daughters becoming suffragettes or feminists. It made him feel rather insecure. And so I'll just read this out, because this is actually from Malinowski. He was having a debate on this whole topic we're discussing this evening. Did matriarchy ever exist? It's a radio debate. I think the year was 1931. And he says this. Okay, now the reason I'm reading this out, I want you to hear the father of modern anthropology speaking to you about his views on this topic we're discussing this evening. And perhaps read behind the lines. Why is he saying this? What's motivating him? A whole school of anthropologists, from Beethoven on, Beethoven, the author of Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, a whole school of anthropologists have maintained that the maternal clan was the primitive domestic institution. In my opinion, as you know, this is entirely incorrect, but an idea like that, once it is taken seriously and applied to modern conditions, becomes positively dangerous. I believe that the most disruptive element in the modern revolutionary tendencies is the idea that parenthood can be made collective. If once we came to the point of doing away with the individual family as the pivotal element of our society, we should be faced with a social catastrophe compared with which the political upheaval of the French Revolution and the economic changes of Bolshevism are insignificant. The question, therefore, as to whether group motherhood is an institution which ever existed, whether it is an arrangement which is compatible with human nature and social order, this question is of considerable practical interest. And he went on to say that he would devote his rest of his life to proving, to the best of my ability, that marriage and the family have been, are, and will remain the foundations of human society. So I'm just saying, this was the dispassionate scholar, the objective scholar, the disinterested scholar who changed the whole trajectory of thinking about the history of the family and the history of relationships between the genders. Right. One of the things which happened to me in terms of thinking about things and reading stuff was in the very early 80s. And I got in touch with an anthropologist called Tim Buckley. He'd been studying a group of Native Americans around the Klamath River on the far western coast of the States in California. One evening in 1978, he was invited to the house of a local informant for a meal. Buckley's male friend explained that he would be doing the cooking since his Yurok wife was on her moon time, in her menstrual period, and they were keeping the old ways as best they could. A back room had been set apart in the modern house for his wife's monthly use. The couple neither ate nor slept together for 10 days each moon. Well, he was there talking to his, Buckley was there talking to his friend when the friend's wife emerged from her room to talk with Buckley about what she was doing and how she felt about it. Because these people were obviously modern people, they all kinds of car mechanics and bungalows and caravans and making a living in different ways, but they were in the movement of revival, trying to get back to their old ways. And this woman said that she had been instructed in the menstrual laws by her maternal aunts and grandmother, who were in their times well-known conservative, traditional Yurok ladies. And she began her account by telling Buckley that as a foster child in non-Indian houses, she had been taught what people in the West had normally taught, which of course is that menstruation is embarrassing, bad and shameful, and that through it women are being punished. This is of course the Adam and Eve story. But on her return to Yurok society, however, she says, "My aunts and my grandmother taught me different. According to the old menstrual laws, a woman should seclude herself during the flow because, quotes, this is the time when she is at the height of her powers. Such time should not be wasted in mundane tasks and social distractions, and certainly not in concerns with the opposite sex. Rather, all of one's energies should be applied in concentrated meditation to find out the purpose of your life. Menstruation is a time for the accumulation of spiritual energy, the flowing blood serving to purify the woman and prepare her for spiritual accomplishment." In the old days, according to this informant, menstruating women used to communally bathe and perform rituals in a sacred moontime pond up in the mountains above the old Yurok village. While many girls performed this rite only at the time of their first menstruation, conservative women went to the pond every month. All of a household's fertile women who were not pregnant menstruated at the same time, a time dictated by the moon, the women practicing their bathing rituals together at this time. If a woman got out of phase with the moon and with the other women of the household, she could get back in by sitting in the moonlight and talking to the moon, asking it to balance her. Through the ritual bathing practice and by maintaining synchrony with wider rhythms, women came to see that the earth has her own moon time, a recognition that made one both stronger and proud of one's menstrual cycle. And just as the women used to collectively withdraw from sexual circulation for 10 days, the men had to sort of vaguely keep up. And so, as if imitating the women, the men bathed and gathered firewood and, avoiding sexual contacts, ate special foods and let flow their own blood, which they got quartz crystals, and they'd gash their legs. So they're saying, yeah, we can bleed too. And the flowing of the blood was thought to carry off psychic impurity, preparing one for spiritual attainment. Men who were in special training to become healers secluded themselves in the sweat house and made medicine. And the anthropologist provides evidence that the medicine baskets and dentalium shells used by men to contain their power tokens were symbolic vaginas. And elderly Yurok men told Buckley that intensive male training was always undertaken during the dark of the moon, which was the time when, according to tradition, women were also synchronously menstruating. And finally, there's evidence that specific features in Yurok sweat house constructions, sweat houses are these sort of lodges. I'll read out some myths about these kinds of lodges in a moment. And the way they were built permitted accurate observation of yearly, solar and lunar cycles in each village, while the women's menstrual houses included large communal dome-shaped structures heated by fires, used for sweating and capable of sheltering several women at a time. And then following an analysis on the literature of the Yurok, including previously unpublished field notes, because it's just strange how these things get lost in translation. You can have all sorts of informants telling you this stuff, but somehow the men dealing with this stuff and publishing articles manage to lose all the information about how menstruation can be empowering and get the other stuff published, and all that somehow disappears. But Buckley reconstructed, looked back in the libraries and got all these original field notes out, and concluded that there has been a consistent male bias in published interpretations of Yurok menstrual symbolism, and that his female informants' claims should be taken seriously. He found reason to believe that indeed the women of Aboriginal Yurok households menstruated in synchrony, utilising the light of the moon to regularise their menstrual cycles. If this were the case, Buckley writes, then it would follow that the menstrual synchrony and power of women not only influenced ritual life, but had, this is a quote, profound pragmatic implications as well in dictating the temporal structuring of activities for entire households on a monthly basis. So just sort of translate that. The entire community had a clock, and the clock was the moon, and which phase the moon was in determined what was happening, what rituals you were performing, whether you're hunting or feasting, whether you're cooking or not cooking, whether you're bathing, all these different things. The moon was the basic clock, and that clock, of course, was not just up there in the sky, but was in every woman's body, and women would make sure that they were in tune with that clock, and of course, you know, it's not all that easy. Sometimes you can get out of tune, but what she said was that a woman would just sit out all night in the light of the moon, hoping that the light of the moon itself would help to bring her back into synchrony. And all I want you to do now is of course, this is just one informant. This is just a woman saying things about the past, and maybe, you know, we might think, okay, why would we believe? For the moment, I don't care about that. I just want you to think about it as a thought experiment. Imagine a world made for women. I think most of you will agree that this world we live in today is a world made for people who don't have periods. It insists that you act during a menstrual period much like any other day. You could argue that it's for people who don't have periods, which means it's a world made for persons with penis and testicles. Imagine a different world, which is a periodic world, where the clock in your body is the clock which makes the world turn round. It's just a thought experiment, but when I heard about all this, it got me thinking. So we have clocks, of course. The clocks we've always evolved with are two in the sky, the sun and the moon. And there's no doubt that both are extraordinarily important. But there's also no doubt that for hunters and gatherers, although day and night matters, it's difficult to hunt at night if you haven't got any light, and the seasons are important, of course. The magic clock, the clock which governs ritual, the clock which brings hunting luck, is the moon. I don't know of any hunter-gatherer culture where the men would pray to the sun for hunting luck, to pray to the moon to give you light is kind of standard. Of course, we have clocks. We have these ones here. I've got one here, and I kind of call these time is money clocks. They were invented to save time, to make sure that you're not wasting time. Perhaps leave aside all that, but simply because it would probably take me time. Getting to 7:30. I've got a little under half an hour to finish. Okay, so I'll move on quickly. So, okay, what do the scientists say about the human female menstrual cycle? Well, the human female menstrual cycle, the mean length is 29.2 or possibly 29.5. There are slight disagreements, days in length. Of course, it varies. That 29.5 day length is, for most women, you'll probably get closer to that rough 29.5 length around the time of your life when you're most fertile. So young women, teenagers, tend to have a cycle a bit slower, a bit longer, and of course as you grow older it begins to speed up a bit. But the time of life when the human female is maximally fertile, it's closest to that 29.5 days. 29.5 days. It is the time it takes for the moon to pass through its phases as seen from the Earth. And countless times I've been confronted by male colleagues who say, Chris, you're being taken for a ride, you're imagining things, don't worry about it, it's just a coincidence. And of course, I accept that. It could be just a coincidence. But my point is that before dismissing it as insignificant, why not explore whether there might have been some adaptive, that means Darwinian, advantage in having a cycle length roughly equivalent to the length the length of a lunar month. I mentioned chimpanzees earlier. Chimpanzee females couldn't possibly synchronize with the moon or with each other using the moon because they have a cycle length way outside the limits. 36 days roughly. Again, it's variable. Of course, some chimps might be 32 days, some 38 days, whatever, but it oscillates around 36. Bonobos, those matriarchal chimps, it's even longer. It's 40 days. You can sort of understand why those primates wouldn't be very much connected with the moon because they're forest dwellers. Not much moonlight gets through they're close canopy forests mostly. One or two savanna chimps, but mostly so the moon light is pretty irrelevant. Wouldn't be too much adaptive logic in synchronizing. But we humans evolved on open savanna. And again, this is going to be a topic we can go into later on. But the thing which made us social was predation pressure. Everybody agrees with that, by the way. It's not really controversial. We didn't live in larger and larger groups because we could find food better that way, or because we wanted to cooperate with each other. It was essentially safety in numbers. I don't think there's too much. Robin Dunbar, actually, who used to teach here, pretty much proved that the very fact that we're such a social species derived from the fact of predator pressure out in the open savanna. Who were the predators? They were big cats. Okay, lions. Even today, they are lunar in this sense that they have extraordinarily brilliant night vision. Their retinas kind of reflect and magnify the tiny amount of light that gets in there. As a result of that, they are brilliant at hunting creatures with less brilliant night vision. So lions actually they're quite lazy creatures. They don't like running a long distance. They like to just pounce on you. If you're interested in science, Craig Packer, I think it might be on the, like reading this, so I can easily put you onto it. Craig Packer and his colleagues, lion experts in Tanzania, did a long-term study of how many people, human beings in Tanzania had been killed and eaten by a lion. And there's lots of bars and statistics. I could have easily put it up here, but it'd take too long. But what they found was that the lions get very hungry around full moon. And they've even got laser cameras. They can point the laser at the stomach of the lion and find it waxing and waning, waxing and waning, waxing and waning. It's had lots of food to eat and hardly any food. Lots of food, hardly any food. And it goes with the moon. Because when the moon's out, they haven't got that night vision advantage. The humans or antelopes can see the lions coming and dash for it. Humans, obviously, if you're human, you better go up a tree. You won't get very far. But antelopes are pretty fast running. And so the maximum number of humans getting eaten by a lion was just after full moon. So the people might be looking after goats or something, and they've been relaxing in the full moon, safe because there's plenty of light. The lions pack it in, by the way, around full moon. But then the next night, the sun goes down, and it's about an hour before the moon rises. So that period of darkness is when the lions, who are already very hungry, they pounce. There's a big rise in the number of humans eaten by lions. Are you following my logic? That it would make sense in the course of human evolution not to go looking for sex around dark moon. You'd get eaten by a lion as you're traveling across the landscape. So it'd be much better to have moving across for sexual reasons and romantic liaisons around full moon when you're safe than around dark moon when you're definitely not safe. Now that's just one argument. There's lots of other arguments in my view about synchrony to explain why it might have been adaptive to have a cycle which corresponded with the cycle of the moon. And in a moment I'm going to read out some myths. So we've been looking at, I've been discussing history of anthropology, length of menstrual cycle, a bit of primatology. I know it's a bit of a big thing, I'm going through all sorts of stuff, and I'm trying to put a kind of big picture together to start you off with in this evening class. And we're going to be looking at mythology, not because I believe in myths, myths are myths, they're not science, but because there is such a thing as the science of mythology, mostly founded by Claude Lévi-Strauss, great French anthropologist who died a few years ago at the age of 100, who did extraordinary work in making sense of the world's mythology and came to the conclusion that all the world's myths have an underlying kind of universal grammar, an underlying structure, and at the end of the day they amount to one myth only. We're going to be talking about that more in the spring term, about mythology. But the reason I'm going to read these myths out is this. As I said earlier, in the West we assume that male dominance is natural. It's just the way things are. It's part of human nature. Now what I want to prove to you is that whether it's right or not, elsewhere in the world that assumption isn't there. And in fact, in those parts of the world, much of Papua New Guinea, much of Amazonia, pretty much all of Australia, but many other parts of the world where men exercise a monopoly over ritual power. So men have a monopoly of ritual power with bull roars or flutes, often quite kind of terrorizing women. Where men have a monopoly of ritual power, far from thinking that's natural, they think the exact opposite. They think that if women aren't terrorized, they're going to regain the natural power which was theirs thanks to them having a menstrual cycle. So in all that, I'm not joking, in all those societies, the myth, and I agree it's only a myth, but we still have to explain why that myth's there, women have this fear that if men were to lose concentration and stop policing the women and stop kind of terrorizing them with these very powerful male-dominated rituals, women would use their natural advantage. And the natural advantage women have, according to the myth, is that they have a menstrual cycle, which enables them to connect up with the moon, which is the most terrifying thing possible. So what I'm going to do is just make that contrast between in the West, where we think, okay, yes, women can get ahead. You can be a banker, you can be a director of the CBI or something, or you can maybe pilot an aeroplane. But whatever it is that women do in our society, you'll be succeeding despite the fact that you're female. Okay, that's the ideology, isn't it? That you can do a man's job, but it would be probably better easier if you were a man, because having a menstrual cycle is a bit of a problem. Maybe you should take more pills, various other things. But that's the sort of assumption that if you have power in this patriarchal society, it's not because you're female, it's kind of despite it. All I'm saying is that in these other cultures, things are put exactly the other way around, and it's just interesting. We need to think about it, trying to explore what it is that makes them believe that. 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 6, 7. Right. This is the origin of the sacred flutes from Papua New Guinea, the tribe called the Gimi. Very short myth. I'm going to give you 4 matriarchy myths. So we're saying, did matriarchy ever exist? I've talked about the kind of 19th century myth of matriarchy, the fact that nearly all anthropologists believe that matriarchy once existed, and now I'm giving you just a sample of 4 indigenous myths of matriarchy, okay? A woman kept the sacred flute under her bark string skirts until one day it was stolen by her brother. On putting the blowhole to his mouth, however, his sister's pubic hairs attached themselves to the man's face. This is why men today have beards. The loss of her flute caused the woman to menstruate for the first time. Ever afterwards, she was secluded each month in a menstrual hut. The men, meanwhile, began playing the flute inside the men's house, and men have held power ever since. Now, in all these myths, right around the world, you have this image, and the image is of a house, a collective, communal, sturdily built, often magnificent men's house. If you trace back temples, churches, back, kind of explaining why these churches used to exclude women, like in Christianity, you couldn't be a priest if you're a woman. Going right back, you find these, if you like, primitive churches, and they're the men's house, taboo to women. No woman should ever enter the men's house. But the myth is saying that originally this was a woman's house. And that what had to happen was for men to steal the power, maybe the sacred flute, the trumpet, the bull roarer, from women, and then break into that house and turn what was once a women's communal menstrual house into this men's house. So here we are, another one from Tierra del Fuego, the Yamana tribe, the origin of Kina. In the beginning, women had sole power. They gave orders to the men, who obeyed just as women do today. The men took care of the children, tended the fire, cleaned the skins, while the women did no work in the hut at all. That was the way it was always to be. The women invented the great Kina hut and everything which goes on inside it, and then fooled the men into thinking they were spirits. They stepped out of the great hut, painted all over with masks on their heads. The men didn't recognize their own wives, who, simulating the spirits, beat the earth with dried skins so that the earth shook. Their yells, howls, and roars so frightened the men that they hastened into their huts and hid full of fear. But one day, the sun man, whenever there's a counterposition of moon versus sun, you'll find that the sun is the emblem of the rising male power, and women are linked to the moon. Again, you can ask yourself why it should be that way around, but it seems to be always that way around. So one day the sun man, who supplied the women's spirits in the Kina hut with an abundance of game, overheard the voices of two girls while he was passing a lagoon. Being curious, he hid in the bushes and saw the girls washing off painting, which was characteristic of the spirits when they appeared. They had also been practicing their imitations of the voices of the spirits. Suddenly the sun man confronted them, insisting that they reveal to him what went on in the great hut. Finally they confessed to him, "It is the women themselves who paint themselves and put on masks. Then they step out of the hut and show themselves to the men. There are no other spirits there. It's the women themselves who yell and howl. In this way they frighten the men." The sun man then returned to the camp and exposed the fraudulent women. In revenge, the men stormed the Kina hut, and a great battle ensued in which the women were either killed or transformed into animals. From that time on, the men have performed in the Kina hut. They do this in the same manner as the women did before them. Okay, I'll carry on. There's not much response there. Fine, I don't care. Right, another one. We're going to have two more. Won't take long now. The origin of the bull roarer, Papua New Guinea, the tribe called the Kwavuru. And I want you to just see, I'm doing kind of what Levi-Strauss does. You take a myth, you take another version, you take another version, you take another version, and each new version fills in some of the gaps in the earlier versions. And the way Levi-Strauss describes it, it's almost as if you're looking at kind of transparencies. One transparency's just got a couple of lines on. You put another transparency, you look through them both, you move them around a bit. Oh, you can sort of see a pattern here. You have a few more transparencies, you look through them all, and you can see a beautiful pattern which can't possibly be an accident. So you look through these myths, and you tweak them a bit, you move them around a bit until you see, there's a common underlying logic to these stories. So, the origin of the bull roarer, Papua New Guinea. Tivra, the originator, was puzzled to hear a faint sound like that of a bull roarer whenever his wife moved. I should perhaps see a bull roarer. Does everyone know what a bull roarer is? Piece of wood, this slat of wood about this long, flat, little snaky markings, a bit of string on the end. You whirl it round and round and round. It's easy to make them. They make a roaring sound. What you need is about 30 people making this roaring sound. Woo, 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 woo. It sounds, I don't know, it sounds like an aeroplane in your room engine. Or it has been said it sounds like the noise a wounded dragon might make. But it's when you hear it, you know that you've heard that sound somewhere before. And it was when you were in your mother's womb. It was the rushing of the blood. Woo, 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 really loud in your ears. So the bull roarers were often used, and throughout Australia and many other parts of the world, as kind of the auditory accompaniment of the sound of the blood. So the blood is shed in these rituals, but the blood has a sound. The sound is the sound of the bull roarer. It's like a voice of thunder, and whoever has the bull roarer has the power. So I'll start again. Tivra, the originator, was puzzled to hear a faint sound like that of a bull roarer whenever his wife moved. He asked her what the sound was, but she pretended not to know. Eventually, Tiv felt sure that it was coming from her vagina, and he commissioned various birds to steal the object responsible. A number of birds swooped down on her, while with beaded back and legs spread wide apart, the woman was engaged in sweeping the village, but each time she frustrated them by abruptly sitting down. Only the parrot got near enough to draw blood. This is why parrots' feathers are red. Eventually, Tiv called upon the little bird Serikuti and threatened him with death if he failed to obtain the sound-making instrument. Tiv shouted to his wife to show a little bit more rigour in her sweeping, and as she bent down and the point of the bull roarer protruded from her vagina, The bird swooped down and snatched it away. The woman lay streaming with her first menstrual flow, while Tiv hugged the bull roarer to his breast and declared that henceforth it would belong to man alone. And you'll just notice in all these stories, womankind first has the bull roarer. It's something to do with menstruation. She sort of keeps it between her legs, and it's kind of not natural for men to have it, but men manage to get hold of it by some kind of trick or violence. And now the last one, the origin of the sacred flutes, Baruya, Papua New Guinea. In the days of the dream time, the women one day invented flutes. They played them and drew wonderful sounds from them. The men listened and did not know what made those sounds. One day, a man hid to spy on the women and discovered what was making those melodious sounds. He saw several women, one of whom raised a piece of bamboo to her mouth and drew the sounds that the men had heard. Then the woman hid the bamboo beneath one of her skirts that she had hung in her house, which was a minstrel hut. The woman then left. The man drew near, slipped into the hut, searched around, found the flute and raised it to his lips. He too brought forth the same sounds. Then he put it back and went to tell the other men what he had seen and done. When the woman returned, she took out her flute to play with it. But this time the sounds which she drew were ugly. So she threw it away, suspecting that the men must have touched it. Later the man came back, found the flute and played it. Lovely sounds came forth, just like the ones which the woman had made. Since then the flutes have been used to help boys grow. And in this case I'm just going to read the ethnographer, Maurice Cordelier, who just gives an interpretation, I think clinching what I imagine he might have already been concluding from the other versions. The message of the myth is clear, says Cordelier. In the beginning women were superior to men, but one of the men, violating the fundamental taboo against ever penetrating into the menstrual hut or touching objects soiled with menstrual blood, captured their power and brought it back to men, who now use it to turn little boys into men. But this power, stolen from the women, is the very one that their vagina contains, the one given to them by their menstrual blood. The old women know the rough outlines of this myth and relate it to young girls when they have their first period. Now I know that some of you may be a bit puzzled by all this. What's all this about menstruation, the vagina, bull roars and stuff? It all sounds a bit unfamiliar. It isn't the sort of stuff we normally talk about in London. And you may think it's not very realistic. And you may think that the kind of solidarity which the men are afraid of in these myths is unlikely to really happen in the real world, or maybe it's impossible. But in 2001, another anthropologist, I mentioned Tim Buckley earlier on with the Europe, she described what happens regularly to this day inside the Bashali, a communal menstrual house used by the women among the Kalasha people of northwest Pakistan. Her name's Win Maggie, a book's called Our Women Are Free, wonderful book. She was so surprised at what she found that she feared her Western readers might not believe her. And she explains, I don't want to make the mistake of leading you to believe that women always achieve mystic solidarity simply by virtue of sharing time in the menstrual house. Yet one of the delightful things, for me at least, is that for a few days women whose paths otherwise rarely cross find things in common. The Bashali is a place of intense physical intimacy where women share knowledge about their bodies that would be unthinkable in everyday life. The reason her book is called Our Women Are Free, that's a statement by men. The men are actually quite proud when they say our women are free. Women in the Kalasha Valley consider themselves free whether married or not. Men are not just supportive but proud of the fact that the women are free to travel wherever they like, free once married to return whenever they like to their home, where they are born, and most importantly free to resist men's demands. In this community there are no isolated menstrual huts. Instead there is a large sacred building serving as a communal meeting house for the women, who see it as the physical centre for their solidarity and freedom. Women congregate here when menstruating or giving birth, so that at any one time there may be as many as 20 women inside, gossiping, laughing and singing together, many with their babies and toddlers. During their stay in what they call their most holy place, women compare notes on the duration of their menstrual flows. So there are no temples, there are no men's houses, but there's this massive building which is a sacred place for women alone. And it tells you, and I think, where the whole idea of being together in a dark place with lots of blood, I won't go into the blood of the Christians are interested in, but and the point, one of the things it says that this Bashali house is off limits to men and provides a period of refuge and reprieve extending for several days. So sometimes a woman might just want to get rid of her husband, and so she pretends to menstruate. and she goes to stay for a few days in this Bashali, in this lodge. And so she describes how a young woman who planned to elope used the excuse of menstruation as a pretext for leaving her family, confident in the support and solidarity she would find. And she describes graphically how women enjoy the intimacy of sleeping in the Bashali, arms and legs wrapped closely together. And what happens in the Bashali is women's secret, so much so that men don't even have the words to ask what happens there. The greatest secrets are the words used to describe menstruation, intimate parts of the body, and details of female reproduction. And being an anthropologist, Wyn Muggy compares these women's secrets and privileges with those so often monopolized by men in their so-called men's houses. Because when you have these men's houses, the men also have secrets, which women aren't allowed to know. And one of the things, the most deep secret, is that the men menstruate. The male menstruate. It was when I first came to UCL here, actually, when was it, 1978, I think. I heard a lecture by Mary Douglas, who used to teach here, and she was giving us lecture on a book called The Island of Menstruating Men, and she was describing the way in which men menstruate on this island. And it's quite painful. It isn't really natural for men to menstruate, but you can always do it. And you have to take, I won't go into all the different things you do, but you've got to cut your penis or cut your arms, shove rough grass up your nose. But men can menstruate if they really try, and you'll find that is actually what happens in these men's houses. And they really don't want women to know the pain and the difficulty it is for men to menstruate. They want women to sort of think that it's somehow a gift from the gods. I've reached the time, I think, when I haven't got to the African bambuti, the Alima house, so I'll leave all that out. Maybe it can happen in the discussion. I'm a bit conscious of time, because I want to leave plenty of time for you to have some questions of discussion. Just end up by saying this, and again, I just really, really briefly on Africa. In Africa, among these immediate return hunter-gatherers societies, the Benjeli, the people of the Kalahari, the Hadza, for example, yes, they're hunting cultures. They're hunting and gathering cultures. And some people think, okay, if hunting's important, that means men are important. But what's forgotten there is that women are in charge of the hunting. Women manage the hunting. It's women who motivate the men to go hunting. And when the men come back with the meat, it's women who take the meat from the men and distribute it. So yes, they're hunting cultures, but the more successful the hunting cultures, the more available is the big game, the more likely it is that women get the men to go hunting. And I did intimate really, really briefly how that's done. It's that badly behaved males don't get any sex. So males that are just hanging around looking for sex are not likely to get any. And what happens is that as the meat supplies run out, women get more and more sort of, I don't know, they start to laugh, they make fun of the men, call yourself a man, what have you hunted recently? Nothing at all. And then eventually the men get the message. And the women say, yes, we like sex, it's fine, but, just go away, for a few days, come back with a zebra, and we'll think about it. And that's the sort of, they don't have money, of course, that's the incentive system for men to behave as proper men and go hunting. And then what happens then is that women are kind of managing the hunt and sort of in charge of society. That's the women's rule time of the month. But then in this framework that Morna Finnegan's developed, like a pendulum, a kind of lunarchy, a kind of communism in motion, once the men have succeeded, the men think they should have a bit of the action. And so from full moon onwards, with the men have used the light of the moon to maximize the time available for them to go hunting, come back with a zebra or some antelope, then of course the fires are lit, the meat's cooked, and everyone has a good time, not just feasting on the meat, but also having lots of sex. So they have this pendulum movement between male power and female power, so that no one sex has a monopoly. I won't go into now, because we haven't time, why it was that changed, but it was something to do with the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, when the moon became more and more irrelevant, and the sun and seasonal change became more and more central. So that all the calendars switched over from lunar calendars to increasingly solar calendars, except on the level of some kind of religion, where even to this day the moon is still quite important. And I'll just end up by saying that we think it's really important to kind of question everything, including the idea that male dominance is natural and inevitable. And the model we're using is that in the course of evolution, gradual cumulative evolutionary change built and built and built and built until evolution culminated in revolution. And the revolution was led by women in the sense that it was female solidarity which overthrew the older primate style system. I mean, it took a long time, of course, tens of thousands of years, but we became human through a process which was not just evolutionary, which was also revolutionary. And so there's an answer to that objection that I mentioned earlier on. No revolution can change human nature. Not even a powerful, massive revolution can actually change the fact that males are going to dominate over females, because the truth seems to be that everything distinctively human about our nature, the fact that we can share our thoughts and dreams with each other using language, the fact that we can see ourselves as others see us, the fact that we can construct rules of morality and more or less, with any luck, stick to those rules, all those features which make us such strange creatures, they were actually the products of the greatest revolution in history. We call it the human revolution. And a kind of hopeful possible message, although there are rather gloomy times we live in at the moment, I agree, is that we won the revolution once. We're kind of a revolutionary species. We did it once. We should be able to do it again. That's it.